Welcome to the 700 Club. It's coming. A little ice age. Could that be in store for the near future? It's happened before, and some scientists are now forecasting it could happen again in the next decade. So what's the connection between sunspots and frigid weather? Mark Martin explains.
The sun develops spots that are about the size of Earth, and they change in intensity and number over time. According to NASA, these sunspots provide a standard gauge of solar activity. That activity rises and falls in 11-year cycles. The next one begins this year, and the current solar activity forecast calls for the weakest in the last 200 years. Astrophysicist Dr. Jeff Zwirink of Reasons to Believe spoke with CBN News about the correlation between sunspots and weather on Earth.
If it continues to drop, one thing we do know is that sunspots, they look at like dark spots on the sun. So you'd initially think, oh, maybe that's because there's less radiation given off. It turns out because of the magnetic fields going on in there, the sunspots actually emit more radiation. And so if there are fewer sunspots, we're receiving less sunlight from the sun. And so you would expect to see a continual decline in temperatures, that things might get colder over the next 10 or 15 years.
According to the New American, more and more scientists believe this lower solar cycle could spark a lengthy period of minimum solar activity, leading to cooler temperatures on Earth. It's happened before. From the mid-1600s to the early 1700s, the sun experienced a period of low solar activity known as the Maunder Minimum. It corresponded to a time on Earth known as the Little Ice Age.
We know from historic records, and these are very early observations of the sun, that there were very few of these sunspots for a very long period, from about 1650 until 1715. And this particular period of low solar activity also correlates with a period where the climate, at least in most of Europe and in other places of the world, was very cold.
So what they noticed is, primarily in Europe, where they were taking a lot of these measurements, what they found is that the temperatures were really cold.
It was also very cold in North America. Colonial art often shows deep snows and ice-filled rivers during the winters. Zwirink says the bottom line is if the sunspot activity continues to drop off, we're going to experience cooler weather for a while. Mark Martin, CBN News.
I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, during the last 50 years, we've probably had one of the most benign weather situations you could imagine. And crops have gone into surplus. We have surpluses of rice, surpluses of wheat, surpluses of corn, and soybeans. But if this happens, there can be a lot of freezing. The North American climate where we live will not be as benign. Crops will not be able to grow like they have been. That means you're talking about famine. You're talking about a lot of people being hurt. But all this business about global warming is going out the door right now, because it's not fossil fuels that's causing the problem. It's the sun, that great big ball that controls our solar system. And if we have a 200-year low of sunspot activity, that means a lot of freezing, a lot of ice, and we'll be so grateful that there's some coal or oil or natural gas available to heat our dwellings. So keep in mind, but the Lord spoke about the time before he comes back, there'll be famine. Well, this could be a time of famine because there won't be enough grain to feed this huge population we have right now. So we're talking about serious business, but it's going to happen. And so those who are running their whole political game has to do, I'm taking care of global warming. Well, believe me, it's going to be freezing cold, and the Maunder Minimum is coming upon us, and we're looking at an ice age, not global warming. So just keep that in mind. Well, in other news, game over. That's what the president tweeted after past comments from John Bolton resurfaced. John Jessup has the latest from our CBN News Bureau.
And Pat, now on the last day of questioning in the impeachment trial of President Trump, the fight over witnesses seems to have shifted in the favor of Republicans, with growing confidence that at least 51 senators will vote against calling former National Security Advisor John Bolton and others. The president weighed in, tweeting "Game over" after a new video surfaced showing Bolton talking about Ukraine policy, but not saying anything about an improper quid pro quo. The vote to call witnesses is then scheduled for tomorrow. If it fails, the Senate will vote to vote for a final vote on impeachment charges. Yesterday, President Trump's defense team argued even if there was a quid pro quo, he did nothing that rises to an impeachable offense.
If a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment.
And House managers in the defense answer 8 more hours of questions, Pat, from senators today.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say this, and I think it's the feeling of the American people. This whole thing is nothing but a charade. Everybody knows that the Senate is not, it takes 2/3 of the vote of the senators to impeach a president, and they aren't about to have it. You might have 2 or 3 that want to call more witnesses, but what do you need witnesses for? We've heard the arguments, we've heard them ad nauseum. Everybody has had their say. Now they've answered a whole bunch of questions that are being asked, and it's time to close that thing down. And I think, you know, who needs more witnesses? They shouldn't be voting on witnesses. What they should be voting on, all right, are we going to impeach the president or not, up or down, yes or no? And the answer is no, we're not going to. We don't have 2/3 vote. We may have Murkowski and a few others who are talking about, well, we're not sure, and Romney talking about witnesses. But who needs more witnesses? Everybody's heard everything they need to hear. They're only repeating themselves now. And it's high time that the American people just breathe a sigh of release and say the charade is over. There is no way the president's going to be impeached. There's no way there'll be a 2/3 vote in the Senate. So why don't they respond to the obvious and say, we've heard all the arguments on both sides. We've given them plenty of time. They've asked questions. We have had the House managers give their point of view. We've had the opposition on our side give their point of view. Now it's all over. We've heard enough. We don't need any more witnesses. We don't need any more discussion. Let's take a vote. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, Friday should be the day they say, all right, enough's enough. Vote. Either we're going to impeach him or not. And the answer is no, we're not. So game over. Okay? Well, John, you're next.
All right, Pat. Mixed reviews on President Trump's Middle East peace plan released earlier this week. David Brody sat down with the U.S. ambassador to Israel to find out why he believes this plan will work when all others have failed, and why it would mean good news for Christians visiting the Holy Land.
There were several people who provided quite a bit of input into this Middle East peace plan. One of them, a significant player, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. He has seen tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians go on for a very long time. So the question now, why this plan? Why now? And can it even work?
What this plan does is it presents a hard offer to the Palestinians, the first they've ever received, the first time Israel's ever identified with specificity what are the territorial dimensions within which they're willing to live side by side with the Palestinian state. What are the terms under which they will accept the Palestinian state? What are the security protocols under which they will live next to a Palestinian state? So it's a really hard offer for the Palestinians. And on top of that, Palestinians have 4 years to claim the prize. 4 tough years. They have to, in that period, stop the malign activity. Hamas has to disarm. Islamic Jihad has to disarm. They have to stop paying terrorists. They have to stop inciting hate.
How do they even get there at this point? They don't trust Trump. They don't trust folks coming from this administration.
Well, look, this was designed to, if not regain or obtain the trust of the leadership, at least to obtain the interest of the Palestinian people. Look, the leadership has failed the Palestinian people for generations. They've become pawns in larger conflicts, and the leadership has shown itself to be very adept at misdirecting the resources of the territory to their own pockets. And so the fact that they're not jumping for joy right now is not a great surprise to us, because they thrive. Their business plan is to continue to foment this hatred. But the people within the territories, they are suffering.
As for evangelicals traveling to Israel, Friedman says there's good news in this proposed peace plan. Israel would have sovereignty over many historical biblical sites, which right now are hard to get to.
Israel has not yet obtained sovereignty over those territories. If they do, and our plan contemplates that Israel will, you're talking about opening up the Bible, bringing it back to life in ways that I think your listeners could not even have imagined. I mean, imagine just ease of travel under Israeli civilian autonomy, Hebron, Beit El, Shiloh. I mean, it's an opportunity for biblical tourism that I think will grow and flourish in profound ways.
On this president, the Israeli transportation minister, I think, just recently said he's God's messenger in the White House. I mean, is Trump kind of heaven sent for you guys?
Well, look, when it comes to events that transpire, whether it's with regard to Israel or anything else, I mean, I'm a believer. I believe that God runs the world. So that would apply to the president. It would apply to you, me, and the cameraman. So that's not news to me. And
just to clarify, you would say it's not news to you. You're talking about kind of a, you know, God puts people in certain places for certain times, kind of for such a time as this?
I think God puts people in places for certain times, at all times.
And Trump is Exhibit A of this.
He sure is.
David Brody, CBN News.
Thanks, David. And Pat, both Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and General Benny Gantz, locked in this political battle, both endorse this plan.
Well, I think when it's all finished, they need to get together. I mean, Benny Gantz is a nice guy, and he should be Minister of Defense, and Benjamin Netanyahu should be Prime Minister, and they ought to get on with life. But I'm sure that Gantz says, well, as long as there's corruption, I'm not going to accept him as a joint partner. But they've got to come together on that. And I think all this business of trying to indict Benjamin Netanyahu for trying to get a favor from a broadcast entity, I mean, it's just, I think it's a little far-fetched. And I believe they've got to come together, and a house divided can't stand, and they have too many external enemies to allow a split among themselves, because they have to unite against common foes, among which, of course, Iran is a big one. Well, you know, what happens if the Democrats gain control of a lower house and an upper house and a governorship? Well, we're seeing in Virginia where those in charge are losing their minds. And Virginia, which is my home state, and I was born here and I've lived here. My family has been here for, since 1607 or thereabouts. I am shocked at what's being done in Richmond. They want to take away all the protections of the unborn. They want to take away, of course, the gun ownership has launched a tremendous backlash. And it is unbelievable what they're doing. So John has more on that story of a state gone mad.
Pat, as he was just saying, the Democratic majority in the Old Dominion state is reversing a number of abortion restrictions passed by Republicans over the last decade. This week, the Virginia State House and Senate passed legislation allowing nurse practitioners and certified nurse midwives to perform abortions during the first trimester of pregnancy. The bill also puts a stop to 24-hour waiting periods and requiring ultrasounds before abortions, which often change the minds of pregnant mothers. It now goes to the governor, Ralph Northam's desk, for his signature. Pro-abortion groups are pointing to Virginia as an example of what they'd like to see nationwide, even saying if Roe versus Wade is overturned, they see Virginia as a safe haven for abortion. Well, despite the rollbacks in Virginia, the pro-life movement is growing in America. Last week, massive crowds marched in Washington in support of protecting the unborn. And as CBN's Jenna Browder reports, young people are leading the charge.
Last week, an estimated 100,000 people marched here on the National Mall for the annual March for Life. And leading the way, 200 college students.
Young people are the heart of the March for Life. And it's your generation that is making America the pro-family, pro-life nation.
President Trump giving them a special shout out and making history by becoming the first sitting president to attend in person.
It's an honor for the top leadership of our country to support any cause.
Ethan Van Buskirk is a student at Colorado Christian University and the president of CCU for Life.
We believe that every single human life is inherently valuable, whether that's in the womb or whether that's at the end of life too.
And this younger interest seems to be a growing trend. A Marist poll from February 2019 showed a significant shift among people under 45. That January, 28% identified as pro-life. And just 1 month later, that number jumped to 47%. And those identifying as pro-choice fell drastically from 65 to 48%.
The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired.
Pollsters credit the shift to last year's debate over late-term abortion, fueled by measures in New York and Virginia.
The more people I talk to, the more I am starting to learn that yes, like we're not alone in this. There are more people than we think. There are more people who are deciding one way or the other. And I think that's really cool.
These students point to science, technology, and their faith as the main reasons behind their views.
For me personally, I would say my faith is what inspires me to be specifically passionate about life. I believe in a God who has created life, that every human being has value.
Other data, though, does still show strong support for abortion among millennials. In a Gallup poll from last January, nearly 1/3 of 18 to 34-year-olds said abortion should be legal under any circumstance. Compare that to the 21% of those 55 and older who felt the same way. Still, these CCU students say they can't help but notice what's happening around them.
I absolutely think it's growing. Last year, my school took 27 students, and this year we took almost 200.
And from the National Mall to the classroom, they say their push to advocate for the unborn doesn't stop here. They tell me they're hoping to bring even more of their peers next year. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Thanks, Jenna. And Pat, a strong turnout annually for the March for Life.
So it's remarkable how many young people, because they realize that they were one generation that they could have been aborted, and they say, well, this is a baby. This is our little brother, little sister that they're talking about killing. And that's why the young people feel so intensely about it. But, you know, I think of that word in Jeremiah when the Lord said, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and I ordained you to be a prophet to the nations. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And so God knows the hearts of these babies. And to say this is a medical procedure and that is pro-abortion is a decision, a medical decision of a woman and her doctor, that's not true. That baby should have some rights too, because the unborn, you know, we've slaughtered, what is it, 55, 60 million unborn children, and who knows how much potential would have been there in these young people, how much creativity, how many businesses, how many inventions, how many wonderful laws, how many medical procedures, how many things could this generation have come forth if we had let them live? Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. God formed them in the womb. And the idea of saying, well, we want to give this decision to a woman, and it's her right, and we can kill a baby even in late term as the baby is leaving the birth canal, we can kill it at that point. Or Governor Northern says, well, if they're born, we will decide whether we want to terminate their life even though they're alive. I mean, it's shocking, this disregard for life. And, you know, the Jews have a thing called l'chaim, for life, to life. And I really believe that we should stand for life, the life of the human.